I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to The Daily. And look, it isn't exactly breaking news that for many, many people, it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, in fact, to get on the housing ladder. Now, even staying on that ladder just got that much harder.
My husband and I bought our first home at the end of September 2021. We saved really hard for a modest deposit. It was a 5% deposit, and we were paying through the nose for rent, so we wanted to get on the property ladder at long last and actually have an investment, an asset that was ours.
That is 34-year-old Rachel, and like many others, she and her husband felt certain that stretching themselves to take on a mortgage was the right decision.
The advice at the time was that even though we'd be starting off on a relatively high interest rate of 3.62%, that would come down after our 2-year fix ended. Number one, because we'd added value to the property, but also because property prices would probably continue increasing and that would gain us access to better deals.
But that hasn't happened. Instead, high inflation, strong pay growth and the rising cost of borrowing means mortgage rates of above 6%, not below 4%. And that is going to push Rachel's monthly repayments up by between £600 and £800.
It's a really difficult situation for us. You know, we feel like we did everything right. We took the expert advice. We did everything we were supposed to do. We worked hard, sacrificed anything that could be considered a luxury. We haven't had a foreign holiday since our honeymoon 4 years ago. We don't do meals out or expensive trips, anything like that. We live pretty frugally. The difficulty with that kind of lifestyle is that it's really hard to cut back even further when you're already kind of cut back as it is.
Eye-watering energy bills, food prices through the roof, petrol, diesel still historically expensive, and now the UK faces an extended mortgage crunch. If you're lucky enough to still have any pennies, I'd start carefully counting them.
The situation's really difficult. It's really painful. It's not what we wanted. It's not what we expected. We'll just have to see what the future holds. I'm losing sleep over it. And I know that we've had lots of discussions at home regarding finances and how we get through. All we can do is hold on and try our best and hope we don't lose our first house after 2 years. People have told us that we should have predicted that this would happen. We should have known that we made a mistake buying the house that we did. I just wonder where their crystal ball is and whether or not I can borrow it.
Now, some will suggest that perhaps a saving grace is that today only 30% of households actually have a mortgage compared to around 40% back in 1989. But what happens in the housing and mortgage markets can raise its ugly head elsewhere. Gurpreet Narwan is Sky's business and economics correspondent.
The impacts of this, it ripples throughout the economy. It doesn't just affect people who own their own homes. But let's start with those who do, because that's the starting point. So if your mortgage rate is exceeding 6%, now that might not seem like a lot for people who got their mortgages back in the 90s, you remember paying mortgage rates of around 13%. But you've got to adjust it for the size of the loans that people are taking out now in comparison to their incomes. Back in the 90s, people weren't taking out the kind of loans that they're taking out now. So if we're trying to assess the squeeze, how painful it is, and we adjust mortgage rates for that, well, this is on a par with the 90s, if not worse. It's deeply, deeply painful for homeowners. Now, for people who don't own their own homes, who are renting, well, the people who own the homes they're living in are probably having to remortgage and face these kind of costs. So if your landlord is remortgaging and suddenly they're facing the kind of mortgage rates that homeowners now are facing, they're either going to have to sell, which reduces the stock of homes available, reduces the supply, increases the demand, which means that your rents are going to go up, or they try and pass on some of those higher costs to you, which means your rents are going to go up.
So in simple terms, if you've got a mortgage and it is about to expire, you're about to pay, several £100s more a month?
if you're remortgaging between now and the end of next year, when the Bank of England base rate is peaking, then on average, you face an extra £2,000 a year.
What then is this link between the base rate, the interest rate, that thing set by the Monetary Policy Committee, whatever that is, at the Bank of England, and mortgage rates? What is the link between the two?
So inflation is at the core of all of this. We all know about the cost of living crisis. We all know that prices are rising at a rampant pace. And inflation is quite stubborn. We thought we'd be over the worst of it by now, but it's proving quite sticky.
Bank of England's got it wrong on inflation quite a few times, though, haven't they?
The Bank of England has got it wrong on inflation consistently. You may remember when inflation first became an issue as we emerged from lockdown, economists and the Bank of England used the word transitory. This isn't going to be a sticky problem. We're going to get over it pretty quickly. But it's proved more and more stubborn. We all know food prices are rising at almost close to 20% in the supermarket. Everywhere you go, prices are rising. And one of the tools that policymakers have to squeeze inflation, to get a grip of it, is by raising interest rates. It's meant to be painful because that way you reduce the demand in the economy and you can get a grip of prices. So the Bank of England is raising interest rates to try and dampen inflation. Now, when the bank raises interest rates, lenders also respond to that. So when the base rate rises, mortgage rates rise as well. But it's not just what the bank rate is, it's about expectations of where the bank rate is going to go. So financial markets are constantly making bets about where they think interest rates will be. And expectations of the bank rate have risen consistently as inflation has proven to be more stubborn than we thought. And this is filtering through into the price of our mortgages.
So was this situation that we now find ourselves in inevitable? Was there anything that anyone could have done to avoid us seeing interest rates and mortgage rates of this sort of scale? I mean, you could invent a time machine, go back in it and stop Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng from opening their mouths, I suppose.
The Bank of England has consistently been grilled on this. Why have you got inflation wrong? Why did you think it was going to peak earlier than it did? And the bank will turn around and say, well, a lot of this was out of our control. A lot of inflation in the UK is imported inflation. First, we had the energy crisis, which was out of many of our hands, the war in Ukraine, the impact that had on wholesale energy prices. And in the UK, we were really vulnerable to that because we use a lot of gas to heat our homes. So rising gas prices, wholesale gas prices, filtered through into the prices we pay to heat our homes. A lot of that was beyond our control, but there's a real debate around whether the bank failed to spot other issues like rising food prices. Why are food prices still consistently high in the UK? So, yeah, a bit of controversy in that area.
So what is now going to happen? I mean, let's be fair about this. There isn't a point at which all of the pain kicks in for everyone. And people mortgaged on different days across the course of the year. But there are hundreds of thousands of people who are very, very immediately going to be feeling the crunch, feeling the pinch in their pocket, aren't there?
Yeah, there are about over 2 million people that are remortgaging between now and the end of 2024, which is when the bank rate, as I said, will be peaking. For them, it's going to come as a huge shock because at the beginning of the year, we thought that we would be past the worst of it at that point. So for them, this is something that they may not have factored into their household budgets. But if we take a broader view, so the bank started raising interest rates at the end of 2021. In that 5-year period to the end of 2026, on aggregate, households will have paid an extra 15 billion towards their mortgage payments when we compare it to the final quarter of 2021. 3/5 of that is still to come. So that puts it in a little bit of context about where we are and where we're going.
3/5 is yet to come, and presumably quite a large chunk of that 3/5 comes very, very close to a general election.
A lot of it comes very, very close to a general election. So this is going to make for quite uncomfortable listening for the government.
I mean, both, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak have come out and said, yeah, we are not going to be bailing you out. I mean, I can perhaps see the rationale from the government's position, but I mean, isn't the Labour Party a big fan of the magic money tree these days?
It's politically really difficult because if you're seen to be supporting mortgage holders, homeowners, at a time when home ownership is falling, when many people can't afford to buy their own homes, it's not the most palatable policy for renters, even though this does affect them. It's an indirect benefit that might be quite difficult to swallow.
So are we not going to be seeing significant numbers of repossessions because of all of this?
It all depends on how banks respond and how lenders respond, and how much leniency and support they're willing to extend to their customers. But certainly in the 1990s, when we saw rates hit 13%, it did lead to repossessions. It did lead to a lot of pain for homeowners. So there's a lot that remains to be seen. And one thing that it is worth pointing out is that people go to great lengths to keep hold of their home. You might cut back on food, you might cut back on heating, you might cut back on luxuries. But if repossessions start rising in number, that's a really, really worrying sign for the general economic health of the country.
But basically, this is going to be an issue for anyone taking a first-time mortgage, anyone remortgaging until those rates come beneath 6%.
Yeah, and beyond that, it affects renters, but it also affects the wider economy, because if people are putting more of their money towards servicing their mortgages, then they have less money to spend on luxuries, on food, on going out, on eating out. And all of these things negatively affect the economic well-being of the country. It dampens economic growth. But unfortunately, that is something that this policy in many ways is designed to do. Rising interest rates is meant to dampen economic growth. It's meant to hurt.
Are we headed towards a recession then? I mean, we're talking about some mortgage payers, shelling out 55% of their income on their home. I mean, that's not sustainable.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we thought we'd be in recession by now, and we've managed to skirt a recession so far. But it doesn't
at what cost? But at what cost?
Exactly, and it doesn't feel like that. We may have avoided a technical recession, but what good is that when the cost of living crisis is causing widespread pain for households? We're in a low growth economy, but we're also in a really highly inflationary economy, stagflation, and it's hugely painful for households. It's why the Office for Budget Responsibility, the UK's government watchdog, thinks we're in line for the biggest drop in our living standards, the biggest 2-year drop in our living standards since the 1950s. So we may have technically avoided a recession, but it certainly doesn't feel like we have.
Are we then talking about a generation, perhaps 2 generations, for whom home ownership just will not be a prospect, at least for a decade or two?
Yeah, well, it works in 2 ways. So you have, when mortgage rates go up, when affordability becomes more difficult for people who own their own homes, some of them will be forced to sell, as we said. That increases the stock of homes available, which means there might be some people who could afford to get on the ladder when they previously might not have been able to. They might be able to save up a little bit more and buy their first home. However,
there's always a but with you, Gur.
Yeah, there's always a but, because although house prices may fall, and there are certainly some forecasters who say that they will, all of this certainly points to a drop in house prices. Suddenly, you're facing quite tight lending conditions. It's harder for you to get a mortgage if you're a first-time buyer. The multiple that you'll get on your salary has also been reduced. Many lenders have withdrawn products from the market. So falling house prices might seem like a good thing if you're trying to buy your first home, but everything else is conspiring against you.
The conventional wisdom, look, it has always been that money in bricks and mortar isn't just safe, but it's actually a sensible way of getting a return on your investment. But the old adage that what goes up must come down is also applicable. Gráinne Gilmore is Director of Research and Insights at estate agents Cluttons.
So what we've seen is a housing market that was very busy, very active right during the pandemic. So average house prices across the UK up on average, 18.5% in the 3 years between 2020 and the first quarter of this year. So we're now seeing a market which has been very busy with a lot of upward pressure on prices, and we're seeing the impact of higher mortgage rates on that market. And that does indicate that house prices are going to start coming back. We had that ultra low interest rate period that people got used to, but it was called ultra low for a reason. It wasn't in line with historical norms. But what we're seeing is that stretch point, maybe that interest rates are going to rise higher than people expected even a couple of months ago. And that's what's having an impact in the market at the moment.
Are falling house prices a good thing for buyers?
For buyers, for people wanting to get into the market, they'll want to adjust, but often they're not looking at the short-term decision, that they're not looking to get in and out of the market quickly. This isn't a normal investment. This is somewhere to live as well. Obviously, you want to make a wise decision, but you'll be looking over the medium term. So if that looks like good value to you over the next 5-7 years, then that's how you'll base your decision.
Say, Gráinne, you knew a podcast presenter of your acquaintance had a mortgage coming up soon. Would you be advising them to move pretty quickly onto a variable or a fixed rate in a market such as this? There's just so much confusion. There's so much instability around. I and other people in this position are not exactly sure what to be doing with themselves.
If I knew someone in that position, I would say it's definitely an individual decision, because the real point of fixed rate mortgages is you have security. So you know what it is. Even if you're fixing at a higher rate than you're previously used to, you know what is happening to your household finances for the next 2, 3, 5 years. But the variable rate, it just means that when interest rates do start to fall, you might benefit from those falls. What we're not sure at the moment, and you'd really want to read the mood music from inflation data that's out next week, and the Bank of England's kind of update on interest rates next week, just to see where the mood music is there with the central bank, to decide whether you're happy to take the risk, because you may see some more rises before you start to see falls. But I would be looking at a kind of a tracker rate linked to the base rate if you want security that those rates are going to come down just as soon as the Bank of England moves.
Let me put my professional pessimist hat on just for a second, Gráinne, and try and take us back to the situation the country found itself in the late 80s. We had inflation running in double digits. We had incredibly high numbers of repossessions. People were genuinely concerned about the future of their home ownership. Do you see this as being as bad as it was back then?
I think there's a lot of kind of safeguards that have been put around the mortgage markets, certainly before the global financial crisis. I mean, we had mortgages out there at 125% of the value of a home. There was almost a guarantee house prices are always going to rise. And I think we're not in that situation now, and we haven't been, even with the very bumper period we had in the housing market. There hasn't been that assessment. House prices will always rise every single year. I think there's been a kind of an awareness that this can go up and down, and an awareness that interest rates will rise. There is no doubt that some homeowners will be put under more pressure because of the rising cost of living at the same time as these mortgage rate rises. But it's not a one-off shock. We've known that this is coming, and what's happened in the last couple of months is it's not a case of we're getting up to 4%. It's a fact that it's just stretching a bit further to 5 and 6%. And that may cause a greater number of homeowners to feel more pressure as we move through the next year or two. But to me, it doesn't feel like that swoop, sudden shock to the system. And with the global financial crisis where banks couldn't lend, again, a sharp shock to the system. But I'm not in any way saying that there isn't going to be more pressure on some homeowners across the country.
To what extent does the availability or lack thereof of housing stock in the United Kingdom play into the situation that we're discussing?
The shortage of housing has been a long-term problem for policymakers across the country. We don't get anywhere near what the government's targets are for house building, and I think now that we don't have many targets for house building, and there is a clear lack of supply, and supply where it's needed, and in the price bands it's needed in, and the tenure it's needed in. So anything to encourage more homes, to get more homes into the system, to bring down that very high kind of imbalance between demand and supply in the housing market, which is one of the factors that put such upward pressure on pricing during the pandemic.
I'm perhaps about to ask the wrong person, given who you work for over at Cluttons, Gráinne, but I am wondering, in this country, we do have an obsession with home ownership that is not necessarily shared with some of our closest neighbours in Europe. Is it perhaps time for the United Kingdom to reappraise home ownership as being a goal, a goal of adulthood?
I think it's more a societal thing, isn't it, rather than just plain finances. But if we're going to do that, then we look at a rental market where the changes to legislation means that a lot of individual buy-to-let landlords on who we rely to provide the vast majority of the 5 million private rented properties in the UK, the tax changes that have been introduced, the regulation changes that have been introduced, everyone wants to create a system which is fair to tenants and gives them more security. No one would decry that, but there's other changes that have happened for landlords, which means that landlords are now leaving the sector, putting even more pressure on the supply of rented property. So I think until you can balance out those two sides, then that's going to be a problem, shifting the focus away from home ownership.
And perhaps then just a word of reassurance, perhaps even for some of our younger listeners, that this market does tend to go in cycles, that there are horrible moments and then there is reprieve and release.
Absolutely. And it can go at different times in different areas. We saw in central London markets, we saw a real resurgence in those markets very soon after the global financial crisis. And then the rest of the country followed from about 2013. Of course, the global financial crisis ran from kind of 2008 to 2010. The housing market can be kind of volatile. You only need to just look up, one of the house price indices over the last 30 years, and you'll see it's definitely not a straight line. It does go up and down. So just keep looking at the medium term. Is this going to suit your finances if you're looking 3, 5, 7 years out? And then you can make individual decisions about what best suits you for where you want to live and how you want to live in the years ahead.
My thanks to Rachel, to Gráinne and to Gurpreet. This edition was produced by Emery Woodhouse with Alex Eden. Our editor is Adam J.